Welcome back everyone to the next installment in the build series. Today we will be going over the Deathcaller Mage, which offers an extremely unique playstyle. Now there are a couple of strong ways to play Deathcaller, and I will be making videos for the other options, but today we will be focusing on the power of the beam. This build is basically an anti-mercy. Instead of healing characters with the beam, you'll be lasering them and healing yourself. You will basically be an invincible lawnmower. This is possibly the easiest way possible to play the game, as the laser locks on for you, always keeps you at full health, and actually evaporates anything in your path. This is one of the strongest builds I have used so far. Now let's get to the early game. For character creation, the best option for this particular build is without a doubt the Veil Jumpers, as they give us weak point damage. With that being said, I would also recommend Shadow Dragon's mana regeneration for the early game. As always, I will recommend playing your favorite faction over choosing one based on passives. Mage's early game is bad, this is already pretty well established in the community. However, this build does get Frost Nova early on, which doesn't use mana and keeps enemies at bay, making the early game close to as easy as possible. As always, on my recommendations is to avoid using your beam early, as it will consume far too much of your valuable mana that you need for spells that are much stronger. The primary spells in the early game will be Frost Nova, Ice Blast, and Corrupted Ground. Frost Nova is the MVP ability of this build throughout the entire game. It is extremely valuable from the level 3 until you beat the game. Frost Nova will freeze all of the targets around you, allowing you to get through your auto attacks easier so that you can land those sweet triple autos at the end of your staff progression, or to detonate your bombs if you decide to go with Orb and Dagger. Ice Blast is simply just a decent damage option early as a replacement for Arcane Shot. It also weakens enemies and can chill them. Lastly, for the early game, we have Corrupted Ground. This synergizes extremely well with Frost Nova. Use Frost Nova, then use Corrupted Ground, and the enemies will be absolutely eating necrotic damage, without being able to do anything about it. While you pelt them down with your staff, this makes for probably the easiest early game a mage can have. As far as early game passives go, there's not really any worth mentioning that stand above the rest. All of the absolute game changers that define the build are within the Deathcaller skill tree. For the early game equipment, I recommend just experimenting and trying out whatever weapons and armor you would like. It's not really possible to make a build cohesive in this game before the level 25 to 30 range, so just grab whatever sounds good or just deals the most damage. Now after level 20, we enter the mid to late game, and we will be acquiring the Deathcaller specialization and acquiring some very insane passive abilities. In my experiences, testing out builds so far, the passives in Deathcaller are really a step above anything else. They are genuinely, game-breakingly insane, when all put together. The late game abilities are going to feel extremely weird, and to be honest, they really just don't matter. We are going to be playing Power Wash Simulator for the rest of the game, and the abilities are purely meant to support that playstyle. We will have no mana with this build, so we are opting for all of our abilities to have cooldowns instead. The first of which is Frost Nova. This ability is still going to stay with us, and it's still by far our most useful ability. By the endgame, the area is so large that we pretty much freeze the entire battlefield, allowing us to beam down enemy heads that much easier. This build is pretty much just about making it as easy as possible to beam enemy weak points. Secondly, we have Ice Blast. With a passive, we get this ability will cost no mana. It also does pretty high damage in a large area and weakens the enemy. Lastly is Dark Squall. This is another ability that costs 0 mana. Again, this ability is another that really doesn't do damage. Dark Squall is nice to use against targets charging you, as it pushes them away, knocks them down, and chills them. Finally, the ultimate for this build is the Crypt's Herald. In my experience in this game so far, this is easily one of the best ultimates in the game. It's probably the best emergency button in the game. It does great damage, makes you invincible for a decent period of time, and heals you right back up. Because of some of the equipment we use, we will have this up 24/7, making it nearly impossible to die. I wanted to build towards this ultimate, as I actually do enjoy using it quite a bit. The passives are the real champions of this build, and you absolutely need to know how to use them. First, we're going to start off with the best one, Death Surge. This passive is it. It's literally the entire build. After you get this passive, the game is over, you win. In combination with the other passives we will talk about, this passive is nuts, and basically turns into a win game button. In the gameplay you see in the background, I always have Death Surge going. So every time you use your staff, make sure to overcharge it right away. It's what makes the staff deal such incredible damage. Next up is Invigorating Beam. This is what makes us unkillable. If you're constantly doing high amounts of beam damage, this passive will make it so you pretty much instantly heal right back up to full if you take any damage. Thirdly is Soul Burn. I don't use this one nearly as much because honestly the overcharge pretty much instantly evaporates all of the targets anyway. But if you are very accurate, think of this passive like a sniper. Aim for weak points and you will see yourself doing very high damage. Lastly, we have Mortalitasi. This one is probably the second most important of the bunch because it allows us to just infinitely keep going with our evaporation machine, using health instead of mana for it when we run out of mana. But you still won't lose health because it gets so much back from Leech. The weapons we will be using are the Fade Light, Enchanted Athame, and Shadow Breath. The Orb and Dagger are just entirely used for their passives, but the staff is pretty nice for the build. Fade Light just slightly boosts our damage and boosts our healing pretty heavily, ensuring you're always topped off. None of the orbs really do a whole lot for this build. Enchanted Athame is a big damage boost because we never have mana. Enchanted Athame is just the best mage blade in the entire game, and if the build can work around not having as much mana, it's easily the best in slot. Lastly, for weapons, we have the Shadow Breath. Now this is a very nice staff for this build in particular because of its extra ranged and weak point damage, which we will be doing quite a lot of. But honestly, you can switch your staff around based on what enemies you'll be facing, so you can get a super effective beam, such as using Fire Staff against Darkspawn or Necrosis Staff versus Anton. I know some people will mention the Bargain Staff in the comments, and that staff does work excellent with the Deathcaller specialization, and you can use it for this one. But it is best on an ability based build, and this build kills people way too fast for abilities to really even be a factor. The next Deathcaller build I make will very likely feature the Bargain Staff. The helmet will be the Forest Guardian's Veil. This is actually pretty bonkers on this build, and is one of the reasons we kill things so fast. It gives us so much damage for this build, especially versus barriers. Barrier enemies might as well not even exist when using this build. For armor, we have the Quick Start Leathers. Again, much like the helmet, just gives us more range damage, in particular versus enemies with barriers. The amulet is a Pale Reflection. This amulet pretty much just gives us a permanent 20% damage boost, allowing us to mow down the weak enemies instantly. Super good amulet, and because this is not an ability based build, this amulet is easily the best choice. It also pretty much ensures we always have our super up. The rings of choice are Graven Opal and Biting Thumb. These rings are the best option for non-ability based builds almost always. Graven Opal is basically the same as our armor pieces, more weak point damage, more range damage, which is 100% of what we are doing. It's perfect. Biting Thumb is a bit worse than Graven Opal, and honestly not really that insane, but it is a little bit of extra damage, so why not? The belt for this build is pretty much irrelevant, so I decided to have fun with it, and went with the Glorious Ultimatum. You do not need healing at all with this build, you will always be full health because of your beam. So why not just make sure your ultimate is always up. So whenever you find yourself in danger, you can just press your ultimate. This belt can be acquired from the quest Dead Men Tell Some Tales. Finally, for runes, I like to use Shatter for the extra passive damage, and the active itself is quite nice as well. Pierce for the extra penetration, and again, this active is one of the better ones in the game versus tankier enemies. And lastly, we have Ascend. This rune I completely just used for the 10% damage buff. This rune would very likely be a death sentence with this build, so do not activate it. As mentioned previously, this build is just a power wash simulator. It's certainly not the most exciting style of play, but watching enemies disappear from 2 seconds of a beam is kinda funny, and you really can't die. It's pretty much impossible to mess this build up. Use Frost Nova to freeze enemies, and then just beam them in their weak spots until they die, and then repeat. Use Ice Blast for a little extra damage, and use Dark Squall if you want an enemy to get away from you. For companions, the world is really your oyster. Do whatever you want, because you don't really need healing, detonations, or invulnerability. However, I do heavily recommend bringing companions that slow time for easy weak point damage or have CC. For example, I really enjoyed using Nev with her Blizzard ability, because it was effectively just another Frost Nova for me, while mine was on cooldown. As a reminder, there is a link in the description to a full level by level guide. Let me know what you think about the build in the comments down below, and please click the like button if this video was helpful. Lastly, I want to thank those who have been supporting the channel with memberships and tips. It really means a lot. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.